Hey fellow freelancers, Johnny5 Alive here, and welcome back to another Anthem video. Today we're going to be talking about the loot system in Anthem's endgame, and some of the recent talks about the nerf to the loot system on the day one patch release, as well as a message from Travis Day, one of the lead designers on Diablo 3. He has some insights to Anthem's loot system and endgame. So stay tuned, and let's get into it. All right, so there has been some posts on Reddit. People were saying that the loot was nerfed, and Ben Irving came out to say, hey, an update on what happened here are in our Friday changes, one of the edits we made had a side effect of increasing certain drop rates. This was not intended. Once we identified the problem, we changed it back to how it was before. That was about 11 hours later. So I'm just going to stop there. I just want to make a point there that it seems like rather than the loot being nerfed, there was 11 hour of, I guess, bonus loot drops, which was pretty interesting. And people that were getting loot in that period were reporting like 5-6 legendaries per, half an hour or something like that. Crazy amounts of loot. And I recently made a video showcasing getting fully geared in a day, 11 hours of playing. I got 34 masterworks, 2 legendaries, and I thought that was insanely generous. And I was basically putting out there that the loot is raining like Skittles from various forms of activities. So the current state of the game when I made that video was after this patch where the loot was in fact nerfed, and I was experiencing a lot of loot. So I could imagine how much loot people were getting prior to this in this period of time. So in the current state of the game, there's a lot of people saying that like make loot great again, all sorts of stuff on Reddit. But I personally find that like, yes, there is a lot of loot, but a lot of the rolls are pretty bad. So it's like insignificant loot, tons of stuff to talk about here. So I want to give a shout out to Mr. Stash for bringing my attention to this post here. This post by Travis Day, a designer that used to work on World of Warcraft that transferred to the Diablo team in 2012 and worked on the Reaper of Souls as a designer for the balance and loot system there. And here he has to say, I've been playing Anthem for the last week and really enjoying myself. However, this game seems to fall into a number of reward system related traps that I wanted to take a moment to point out and offer some possible solutions to in an effort to make this game, which I'm enjoying, more compelling. Dead inscriptions. By now I suspect people have seen item rolls with stats they don't understand. The man icon means it affects everything you do. Cog icon means it only affects the item that it rolled on. Currently the game allows for items to roll inscriptions that literally cannot affect the item they are on. Example, Venomous Blaze with the item specific physical damage plus what % weapon damage or plus % cold damage. Having items roll affixes that are suboptimal is standard practice for this kind of game, but I think there should be a hard distinction between bad and literally doesn't work. Currently, this causes a considerable amount of confusion for the players learning the game, as their initial assumption is to think any item rolled would work on the item it rolled on. Since that isn't true, I assume the designer's intent was to create a larger spectrum of item-based powers based on the rolls. I would argue it comes down to too many drawbacks. Keeping the spectrum of item power large could easily be accomplished by simply changing the relative weighting of affixes while restricting them to things that actually work on the item. Alternatively, items could have affix range. Masterwork could roll 2 to 4 or 3 to 4 properties on creation, so there is still the same amount of item variance, but the affixes show up continue to still work on whatever they're rolled on. So I want to give my kind of overall thoughts on this as well. There are a lot of rolls where you're like, this just doesn't work, or why would I want that? Getting like assault rifle ammo increase on a pistol, I guess that could technically work for the offhand assault rifle that you're wearing, but sometimes it doesn't, and it's just overall really freaking confusing. I think for an assault rifle roll, you would want certain things like weapon damage, some sort of affix that adds like fire to the assault rifle, actually allowing it to prime. You would want a specific amount of rolls, crit damage, crit multiplier, and all that stuff. There should be like a set that can only roll on that weapon, and so forth and so forth on all the different abilities, components, and that sort of thing. I feel like the current state of the loot is very vague and confusing, and we need a little bit more tuning done on that. But what happens when some adjustments are made? Are they going to roll back the items we have and let us re-roll them and update them to new roll tables, or do we physically have to go reacquire them. Nonetheless, we do know that something needs to be changed here because there's so many junk rolls that the people who actually get good rolls on their items, these seem like insanely powerful weapons when in fact they're just average weapons and everything else is just bad rolls. The chances of you getting a good item is really, really bad. So Travis goes on to talk about risk versus reward. This is pretty common pitfall that a lot of games run into. The game I worked on including, it's always going to be subject to some amount of individual perception about what is easy versus what is hard. At present, it seems the three strongholds have different relative tuning of the final boss encounters, Tyrant Mines, Temple of Scar, and Heart of Rage being progressively harder as you go on in terms of difficulty overall. The first time I went in to fight the Heart of Rage boss, it took me 30 minutes for my group to defeat the end boss. Relative to the time it takes to kill the Tyrant Mines, this felt wildly disproportionate. My take was that they didn't have many dungeons, so they wanted them to effectively be tiered in difficulty. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any reward incentive to justify scaling between the three dungeons within a given difficulty setting, even ignoring that particular case that the dungeon between the Tyrant boss and the Scar boss was vast, based purely on the invul windows and the difference in fighting swarms of spiders versus swarms of Scar enemies. There are a number of potential solutions on that front, whether it's bringing the dungeons into the same relative difficulty scale or increasing the rewards to match the difficulty. Either direction is reasonable depending on the design goals, but at the present it's considerably mismatched in both directions. Now I have to agree to this and I want to add my own flavor to it in terms of Grandmaster 1, 2, and 3. So right now, I think the best solution is to scale them to match. So the Heart of Rage dungeon needs to be considerably easier. The time to kill, start to finish, should be half an hour for all three dungeons. So even the Temple of Scar last boss needs to be tuned down a little bit, or the Tyrant Mines needs to be tuned up a little bit so that they're on par. Temple of Scar takes about 5 minutes longer than Tyrant Mines, and some people have, it's more of a struggle for a random team. Whereas on Tyrant Mines, random teams seem to do well, and on Temple of Scar, it seems that a coordinated team is more likely to beat it in the same time as Tyrant Mines, but it's still harder overall. Heart of Rage is just ridiculously hard, or not even hard, it just takes a very long time. So they need to make the bosses a little bit less spongy for Temple of Scar, just by like maybe a little bit, 20% or so, bringing it down to Tyrant Mines. There's some tuning that needs to be done there. Heart of Rage being scaled back. Now all three dungeons are equal. That way you can add in a random queue, and then you can queue up for these dungeons and get an additional masterwork or legendary at the end. So maybe if you queue up for Grandmaster 1 random, you get an extra masterwork that could be a random component, weapon, or ability, and that way you also get one off the boss, guaranteeing you 2 for GM1. And GM2, maybe you get a legendary, something like that. I don't like the idea of a difficulty scale where they're supposed to be progressively harder, because if you make it so the Heart of Rage rewards you for the amount of time that it was, how difficult it is and how long it takes you to do it, then suddenly what happens is people go, oh, well, if I do Heart of Rage, I get a legendary, so that's the one I'm going to farm. It creates a meta of determining what's the best way to get loot, and then you still farm the one thing over and over and over again. You need variety, so I think the best way to do it is to match the difficulties throughout the three dungeons and add in a random queue option with a bonus reward. Travis goes on to say, lack of incentive for random strongholds. I'll put this here since it's directly related to the stronghold issue, and whether or not this is even addressed is determined by the solution above, stronghold risk versus reward. If the intent is the dungeon are tiered, then it isn't something that needs to be addressed. If the intent is the dungeons are comparable in difficulty, then the lack of bonus or incentive to diversify which dungeon I run is an issue. Players will generally follow the path of least resistance. At present, this means Tyrant Mines repeatedly, which is true. This also increases the speed of which players will burn out, since the game feels shallow and lacks variety. Also true. There is a lot to be said for diversity in combat environments and situations. While I personally am enjoying trying to optimize my path through Tyrant Mines, it is certainly making me bore of the somewhat limited content that is available. I agree, I love perfecting Tyrant Mines, and if all the dungeons were just equal, it would just give you something more to practice and grind through, and it would add a lot more replayability. Simple solve, assuming dungeons are roughly equal in challenge, is add a random stronghold to the available mission queues and attach some sort of luck magic drop a fine bonus for doing it. Okay, so he's saying like the same thing I was. So obviously I agree with this, but I don't like the idea of luck magic find. I think something guaranteed for, you know, I queued up for random, I should get something for random because I don't know what I'm doing. Otherwise, people are just going to keep picking Tyrant Mines. If there's a chance you get bonus loot for doing the other ones, it still might not be efficient. So I still think something guaranteed for doing random or a bonus incentive for queuing up as a random dungeon would be the way to go. But this is definitely on the right idea. I definitely agree with this. Moving on, Travis says here, player agency / targeted farming. I like the recent change to help distinguish the different activities from each other. Strongholds always drop masterwork skills. Legendary contracts always drop masterwork class mods. Giving players a degree of agency over the RNG is great. In this kind of game, players will always set goals. I want item X. I want to make build Y. Typical point of frustration is when players can't deviate their gameplay patterns to work towards whatever goals they're set. At present, I can chain run strongholds to try to hunt for specific skills, and that's great. Unfortunately, the legendary contracts aren't something I can explicitly farm. I can do the couple I get a day, and in theory could chain queue quick play in hopes of getting match made into more, but that leads into queue dodging behavior. This is so true, and I gotta touch on this before we move on, because this is one of my frustrations right now, is the strongholds always drop skills. But that's the thing, I like to play strongholds a lot. What if that's my favorite content and I do want to just farm it over and over and over again? I should be able to get a gun at the end or a class mod, anything from the loot table. But no, that only happens if I randomly get loot off of a kill in a stronghold, because that's considered like a world drop, which is extremely frustrating overall. The problem is when you beat the strongholds as much as I have, you already have every ability in the game, and now you're just looking for components and guns. So now I have no reason to run the stronghold ever again, because the only thing I'm hoping for is a random kill to drop loot, and I can do that in free play or a contract, which has a better chance of essentially getting me a gun as well, or a component. So he moves on to say, if there is an intent to give players agency over their activity, they need to be able to actually commit to that choice. At present, if my goal is get better class mod, I have a very limited degree of control, after which I'm unfortunately incentivized back into dungeon farming. One large problem there is masterwork skills that have tremendously different value depending on how I'm trying to approach the game. If I want to be a storm who is incredibly well rolled skills and shoots guns as a filler or buffs, looking at you elemental rage, then it is great. But if I'm a colossus who uses skills for their utility and focus primarily on damage output by my gun, then farming dungeons isn't reasonable, moving me towards my desired goals. Personally, I like the idea of leaning into different activities, guaranteeing me different item slots. The only real problem here is that I can't make that choice every time I enter queue. Skills are covered by dungeons, components have limited coverage based on players' inability to chain queue them, and weapons have no activity directly offering them, which is really interesting but also kind of untrue. So weapons can be directly farmed on hard mode or lower, but it's pulling from a limited pool of guns. But what's funny about this is it's the only way in the game to guarantee yourself some weapon drops, and if you don't have any weapon components or you're very low on them like I am, it actually makes sense to go back to hard mode or lower so you can pull from this loot pool until you have all the weapons on said loot pool, and then you have yourself a nice pool of weapons. Or you can, like, let's just say for example, the Avenging Herald is a very good storm pistol on that loot table, and the chances of you getting it from the entire pool of everything combined in free play is very low. But by going to hard mode or lower, the pool of items is reduced to like 6 or 8 items overall, meaning you have like a 1 in 8 chance of getting an Avenging Herald on hard mode, which means you can repeatedly farm hard mode to get the Avenging Herald until you get the rolls you want. But the guns that are not on that loot table are extremely hard to come by, and also extremely hard to get the rolls you want on them because they're not dropping. And the problem with all the masterworks coming from the end of a stronghold or the end of a contract is their components or abilities, and I'm having a very, very hard time getting weapons to drop on anything but hard mode. So there's a whole list of weapons that are extremely hard to come by, and that's the point Travis is trying to make here. But I also wanted to point out, for those who do want at least some weapons, you can go do hard mode or lower for a set pool of weapons. And that is a way to kind of focus in on some weapon drops, which is interesting. Then he continues to say, lack of granularity in difficulty. Given the structure of this loot game, the relative power level of any two given players doing the same content at the end game can be enormous. Players' goal is to find better items and continue advancing through the content and challenges. As is, it stands the difficulty jump between Grandmaster 1 and 2 is big enough once you've reached the point where GM1 feels trivial and attempt to enter GM2 to find enemies feeling like bullet sponges who one-shot the frailer classes in the party. I love a good challenge, but going through this is trivial to this is hard and definitely not worth the time and energy, causes players to continue farming content that is easy without ever feeling they should put themselves in a position where they are reasonably challenged. Now we have to stop here because I'm one of the few who has beaten Grandmaster 3 Tyrant Mine Stronghold, one of the hardest, the hardest thing to do in the game right now. We got 2 guaranteed masterworks at the end, but you also get 2 guaranteed masterworks from GM2. So there was no increase in loot for going from 2 to 3. And they're still freaking abilities, but we already have too much of. So you get 2 guaranteed abilities, not a gun and an ability, not a component and a gun. No, 2 abilities, which makes it completely not worth it. Not to mention the devs said the drop rate on GM3 was supposed to be like 1,000%. We did not see a single legendary drop from any of the chests or mobs throughout the entire GM3 Tyrant Mines, which is insanely absurd because they do drop on GM1 and even hard mode more often than what is considered or quote unquote supposed to be the highest drop rate difficulty. So it's definitely not worth the effort, and he's right when you say you go back to farming easy content. Ultimately, for this style of game, I think you want players to have peaks and valleys of challenges where they enter a new tier, feel like they want to find things that help them survive as they continue to expand their knowledge, and the AI of the creatures eventually gaining enough stronger gear to where the challenge feels moderate to low, and eventually transitioning into the next difficulty tier. Going from hard to GM1 felt great. The early power jumps provided by the introduction of Masterwork felt good. GM1 went from being holy shit hard to this is trivial over the course of Masterwork and Legendary acquisition. Unfortunately, the transition from GM1 to GM2 doesn't deliver that experience. And I recently said that in one of my loot videos, and I said at the end that there feels like we're missing a step somewhere, and that's what I really wanted to hit on. There feels like we're missing a jump, and if the legendaries were buffed like 50% more and had 6 properties like they were supposed to, and all the stuff that the devs said they would, then all of a sudden getting this legendary gear would make GM2 a nice climb, and suddenly that one would feel like it was GM1 all over again, but with a new set of gear, and you would be progressing, and there does feel to be a lack of a jump here. Tuning content for a power band as high as these types of games allow is difficult, and it's important that the risk versus reward not punish players into thinking the correct thing to do is fight impossibly hard content because they're over rewarded. Either tuning for GM2-3 needs revision or new intermediate difficulties should exist. I 100% agree with that. They need to like tone down GM2 and 3 and add in a 4 and 5. That would definitely change things a little bit. We went through the impossibly hard content and it was not worth it. It wasn't even over rewarded. The end, I hope this sparks some positive conversation about these parts of the reward system that need attention. I've been enjoying the game greatly and intimately familiar with the problem that come with trying to set up a reward structure for a game in this nature. Hopefully this is useful and could contribute to Anthem becoming an even stronger game over time. Thanks for reading to the end. Smiley face. So very cool. Now I want to add in my own 2 cents here because what he said, I couldn't have said it better myself. Obviously he's a game designer. He worked on Diablo, so he's going to say it the best and he understands it the best. And he was very good with his wording here, and I have to agree with everything. But if I were to make my own suggestion, so in the current state of the game, if legendaries were brought up to, you know, more power, more better rolls, 6 inscriptions instead of 4 like the devs said there would have been, and more refined inscriptions overall, as Travis mentioned, a lot of these inscriptions don't make sense, then suddenly weapons would innately become better. Then you tune GM 2 and 3 to be more rewarding, maybe even possibly add in a 4 and 5 and scale up those legendaries to be better, and consider adding in ancient items at the end, which is one step above legendary. And suddenly I think Anthem has a good loot table and a good loot game. That really seals the deal for me, and all you have to do from there is add in new content. At cataclysms, new dungeons, add new weapons and stuff to the loot table, and you're good to go. So I'm personally pretty positive about the future of Anthem, and I think it's a good discussion to have here today. In the current state though, yes, you're just going to be sitting there gearing up all your characters with pretty mediocre and sometimes even broken items, which doesn't always feel good, which is concerning because people are going to start getting bored of Anthem very quickly. Let's hope the devs get on top of this, because I do think it's fixable with just tuning some numbers, and it's not like they have to redesign the whole game and start from scratch. I want to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments below, so fire away. And that's going to do it for me here today, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye now.